I never thought I'd find myself pondering questions like this at this age. But life, it seems, isn't done with me yet. I was standing at the edge of the kitchen, my gaze wandering over the familiar aging wallpaper and the soft yellow light that cast a quiet warmth over the room. After 42 years of marriage, this kitchen was one of many places where Alan and I had shared our lives. Yet here I was, feeling like a stranger in my own home, wondering if I truly knew the man I'd spent all these years with. It had started a few weeks back, with Alan acting different. Not in any grand, obvious way, but in small moments that made me pause, that made me see him anew. It was in the way his eyes would linger on me with a thoughtful look I couldn't read, or the way he'd let certain comments drop, hinting at something I couldn't quite name. For most of our marriage, Alan had been steady, practical, a man of habit, and yet, now he seemed almost restless, like he was carrying a secret, or waiting for something to change. I was, too, in a way. There was an undeniable part of me that felt I'd missed out on some unnameable, thrilling aspect of life. Of course, I loved Alan, and I loved the life we'd built. But that small nagging part of me wondered if there wasn't more I could have experienced. Then, just last night, Alan had dropped a suggestion at the dinner table. A single, quiet remark, yet one that lingered long after the dishes had been washed and the lights turned off. He'd looked at me, his face as calm as ever, but with a spark in his eyes I couldn't ignore. "Rose," he had said softly, "do you ever wonder what it would be like to see things differently? To feel something new?" The words were so unexpected, so foreign to my husband's usual nature, that I found myself at a loss. I'd always thought I knew what to expect from Alan. After all, we'd raised children together, shared loss, joy, and every quiet moment in between. But now I wasn't so sure. I tried to brush it off. Yet here I was, still thinking about his question, even as I unpacked my things from a visit to my sister's. The air felt thick, heavy with something unnamed. Could it be that, after all these years, Alan was feeling the same quiet sense of restlessness? The same desire for something we hadn't allowed ourselves to imagine? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of a choice I didn't fully understand. And in the quiet of our kitchen, with the faint sounds of the ocean outside, I couldn't help but wonder, was I ready to find out? That evening, the soft sounds of waves crashing outside the window filled the quiet space between us. It was a routine evening, as so many had been before. Alan and I had shared dinner, tidied up, and were now sitting together in the living room. But the air felt different, charged somehow, as though we were waiting for something to be said. Maybe it was my mind returning to his words from the night before. Or maybe it was simply the weight of silence. Alan cleared his throat, his gaze still fixed on the flickering fire. He didn't turn to look at me, but I could sense a certain tension in his posture, a quiet determination. "Rose?" he began, his voice calm, though I sensed something deeper beneath the surface. I've been thinking a lot about us, about life, really." His words hung in the air, and I shifted in my seat, unsure of where he was going. "What about it?" "Well, it's not that I'm unhappy, not at all," he assured quickly, finally turning to meet my gaze. "But I wonder if maybe, just maybe, we've settled into things a bit too comfortably." He paused, watching my face for a reaction, but I didn't know what to say. "Do you think we've lived fully, Rose? Do you ever think about that?" I stared at him, trying to gauge his intentions. Alan was the steady one, the rock who never swayed from his path. To hear him speak of wanting something different, something more, was almost unsettling. But perhaps it was just unsettling because it mirrored the quiet questions I had begun asking myself. "We've had a good life, Alan," I replied, careful to keep my tone neutral, but I could feel my heart beginning to race. "Haven't we?" "Yes, we have," he said, nodding. "But sometimes I wonder what it would be like to try something new. To experience something that doesn't fit within our usual lives. Something beyond just us." I felt a jolt of something sharp and unexpected, something almost like excitement, though I tried to dismiss it. "What are you suggesting?" I asked, doing my best to keep my voice steady. Alan took a breath, his expression softening, yet there was a hint of resolve in his eyes. "I want to try bringing a bit of excitement into our lives. I was thinking that maybe we could meet new people, build new connections. Maybe with someone who could, well, show us another perspective on things." His words were carefully chosen, but the implications were clear enough. He was suggesting that we open ourselves up to something outside of the quiet, familiar confines of our marriage. I felt my pulse quicken as I tried to process what he was saying. "Alan, you're serious about this?" He nodded, a faint smile on his lips, though his expression was earnest. "I am. I think we've both felt it, this quiet restlessness that's crept in over the years. We're happy, yes, but maybe we've limited ourselves without realizing it. I want to know what it would be like to experience something fresh, to bring new energy into our lives, into our relationship." I felt my hands go cold. Part of me wanted to brush it off, to laugh at the absurdity of it all. But a part of me, a part I hadn't acknowledged in years, felt a quiet thrill at the possibility. After decades of routine, of predictable rhythms, this was like a whisper of a life I'd never dared to imagine. And yet, it felt strange, foreign. It felt like stepping into a world I had no business exploring. "So, how exactly did you imagine this working?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Alan hesitated, as if testing the waters before diving in. "I have an idea, just one meeting. No pressure, no expectations. I thought we could invite someone over, a friend perhaps. I wouldn't even suggest this if I didn't think it could be good for us, for both of us." I found myself nodding slowly, though my mind was spinning. This was Alan, my husband of 42 years, the man who always read the same newspaper column every morning, who preferred his eggs cooked the exact same way, who was comforted by routine as much as I was. And yet, here he was, suggesting something that defied all of that stability, that familiarity. "Is it that you're unhappy with me?" I asked, my voice a bit more fragile than I had intended. "Or that you feel something is missing?" "No, Rose," he said firmly, his hand reaching out to cover mine. "This isn't about unhappiness. It's about us, about experiencing something together, something we've never done. I don't want anyone else. I want you. I just want to see you in a way that I haven't in so many years. I want us to feel alive again." I glanced down at our hands, his fingers warm and steady over mine. The practical part of me screamed that this was a foolish, reckless idea. We had lived a good life. Why introduce something that could complicate everything? But another part of me, the part that had been quietly aching for years, the part that sometimes felt invisible, felt drawn to his words. It was like he had offered me a glimpse of something I'd buried long ago, something wild and free and alive. "Who did you have in mind?" I asked before I could stop myself, my words barely audible. Alan's face softened, a faint glint of surprise and relief in his eyes. "Just someone we both know. Someone who could be trusted." He hesitated, then added, "Paul. You remember Paul, don't you?" Paul was an old friend of Alan's, a professor and a quiet intellectual. We'd met him a few times over the years, sharing meals and conversations, always enjoying his company, but never feeling particularly close. He was a thoughtful man, reserved and composed, but with a subtle charm that was hard to ignore. I took a deep breath, trying to process this new reality that Alan had just placed before me. It felt surreal, almost like a dream, yet the thrill of it was undeniable. I found myself wondering what it would be like to open our lives, to let another person in, even just briefly. "I don't know, Alan," I said slowly, my voice uncertain. "It feels strange." "Of course it does," he replied softly, his gaze steady. "But strange doesn't mean bad. Sometimes it means something new, something we've never allowed ourselves to feel." I sat there, my mind racing as I tried to reconcile my practical self with this new, wilder side Alan had somehow awakened. For years, we had been content. And yet, the thought of stepping outside that contentment, of allowing ourselves to see life from a different angle, was intoxicating. After a long silence, I finally nodded, my voice barely more than a whisper. All right. One evening. We can try it, if you're sure. Alan's face broke into a soft, relieved smile, and he squeezed my hand. Just one evening, Rose. We'll take it as it comes. As I sat there, watching the flickering firelight play across his face, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a threshold, a door we were about to step through into unknown territory. And though I still felt the echo of fear, I also felt something else. Something I hadn't felt in years. Anticipation. The days following Alan's proposal were a blur of thoughts and emotions, each more conflicting than the last. I found myself moving through our daily routines, as if on autopilot, my mind lingering on Alan's words from that night, replaying them as though searching for some hidden meaning. Did he truly want this? Did I? Yet, as the days turned into a week, I found myself growing accustomed to the idea, feeling a strange mix of nervousness and curiosity. Alan arranged a dinner with Paul, choosing a quiet restaurant in town where we wouldn't be recognized. The whole thing felt surreal, almost like stepping into someone else's life. I wondered if this was how people felt when they broke out of their routines, when they chased some forbidden thrill. The night of the dinner arrived sooner than expected, and as I stood in front of the mirror, I felt a flutter of nervous excitement I hadn't experienced in years. I wore a dress I'd bought years ago, but never had a reason to wear. A simple navy dress that fit comfortably, yet gave me a sense of confidence. It had been so long since I'd dressed up, and I couldn't deny the faint thrill of feeling, for the first time in a long time, attractive. Desired. Alan noticed, too. As he entered the room, he paused, his eyes softening as he took in my appearance. You look beautiful, Rose, he murmured, his voice low, filled with something unspoken. It was strange to feel so seen by him, especially now when we were about to embark on something neither of us fully understood. Thank you, I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper. The drive to the restaurant was quiet. A silence that felt heavy, yet somehow comfortable. We arrived a few minutes before Paul, and Alan squeezed my hand as we walked inside, his touch steady and reassuring. I glanced around the softly lit room, taking in the elegant ambiance, the quiet murmur of voices blending with the clink of glasses. It felt safe, intimate, and somehow appropriate. Paul arrived shortly after, and I felt a jolt of nerves as he approached our table, his tall frame and thoughtful expression putting me at ease, even as my pulse quickened. He wore a slight smile as he greeted us, and as he took his seat across from me, I felt a quiet warmth settle between us. Thank you both for inviting me, he said, his voice calm, genuine. It's good to see you again, Rose. It's been too long. I nodded, surprised by how comfortable he made me feel. Yes, it has, I replied, my voice steady. Thank you for coming. I know this is a bit unusual. Paul chuckled softly, glancing between Alan and me with a kind understanding. Life is too short to pass up an invitation from old friends, he said, his gaze settling on me. There was something in his eyes, something curious and open that made me feel strangely at ease, as though he sensed the questions I hadn't yet put into words. The conversation began with the usual topics: old memories, shared acquaintances, stories from the years since we last saw him. But as the evening wore on, the conversation took a deeper turn, moving beyond the surface to more personal topics. Alan and Paul talked about their careers, the highs and lows they'd experienced, and I found myself opening up as well, sharing stories from my nursing days, things I hadn't thought about in years. Paul listened with a genuine interest, his attention focused entirely on me. It was a strange but pleasant feeling, having someone listen so intently, asking questions that showed he was truly invested in my stories. It was rare, in the everyday routine of married life, to feel seen this way, to feel as though my words held weight. At one point, Alan excused himself, leaving Paul and me alone for the first time. I felt a flicker of nervousness, but Paul's calm presence eased me. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes kind and patient as he looked at me, waiting as though he sensed I had more to say. "You know," I began, my voice quieter, more thoughtful. "I never imagined Alan would suggest something like this. It feels strange, doesn't it, sitting here talking like this?" Paul nodded, his gaze steady. "I imagine it would. But sometimes life offers us moments we never expect, paths we never thought we'd walk." There was a calm acceptance in his voice that I found comforting, a reminder that this was something new for all of us, and that we were all feeling our way through the unknown. I realized, in that moment, that I could trust him. He wasn't here to intrude, to disrupt anything Alan and I had built. He was simply here, open and present, willing to explore this strange new territory with us. When Alan returned, he gave me a reassuring smile, as though sensing that I had found some level of peace. We ordered another bottle of wine, the conversation flowing more easily now, with laughter and shared memories woven between our words. It was as though the three of us were rediscovering each other, finding connections that had long been hidden beneath the surface. As the evening came to an end, I found myself feeling lighter, a warmth lingering from the laughter and connection we'd shared. Alan and I said our goodbyes to Paul, thanking him for the evening, and he left with a soft smile, a quiet nod, as though he understood the unspoken emotions between us. On the drive home, I sat in thoughtful silence, reflecting on the night. There was no denying the bond that had formed between Paul and me, the subtle, electric current that had sparked to life during our conversation. It felt both thrilling and terrifying, like stepping out onto a ledge with no clear sense of where it might lead. Alan reached over, taking my hand in his, and I glanced over at him, catching the same thoughtful expression on his face. He didn't say anything, but I felt the weight of his understanding, his silent support. This was something we were exploring together, something we had both chosen to step into. And I realized with a sense of relief that I wasn't alone in this. As we pulled into our driveway, Alan finally spoke, his voice soft. "How are you feeling?" I took a deep breath, my mind still spinning with the emotions of the evening. "I don't know," I replied honestly. It felt different, but in a good way, I think. He nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "That's all I hoped for. Just something different, something that reminds us both of the life we still have left to live." I looked at him, the quiet determination in his eyes reassuring me, grounding me. I didn't know where this journey would lead, but for the first time in years I felt a spark of something alive, something quietly thrilling, stirring within me. The days that followed were a mix of excitement and quiet tension. I felt something had shifted, not just between Alan and me, but within me. For the first time in decades, I was no longer simply Rose, Alan's wife, or mom, or the dependable neighbor. I was beginning to feel like someone else entirely, someone with secrets, with new desires, and questions that wouldn't stop tugging at my mind. Alan noticed, of course. He'd been the one to initiate this, after all, and he seemed strangely attuned to the changes in me. Every time I caught him looking at me, there was a curiosity in his eyes, as if he were seeing me for the first time. It was a strange sensation, feeling his gaze like this after so many years. We'd shared countless looks over the course of our marriage, glances filled with love, understanding, frustration, or simply the comfort of familiarity. But this was different. There was an intensity in his eyes, a new layer of interest that both thrilled and unsettled me. I tried to put it out of my mind, to focus on our usual routines, but it was as though that evening with Paul had left a quiet pulse beneath everything, a heartbeat that grew stronger every time I allowed myself to remember. I found myself wondering what Paul had thought about the evening, whether he'd felt the same connection, the same unspoken intrigue. I knew I shouldn't think this way. It was foolish, indulgent even. But I couldn't help it. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I found myself replaying fragments of our conversation. The way Paul had listened so intently, the way he'd laughed at my stories, as if he were discovering a new side of me. I had never felt so appreciated, so understood. I realized then that it wasn't simply the idea of novelty that had drawn me to him. It was the feeling of being truly seen. Later that evening, as Alan and I settled down in front of the television, he turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "Rose," he began, his tone cautious, "I've been thinking about what's next." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "Well," he said, taking a deep breath, "I was wondering if you'd be open to seeing Paul again. Just the two of you." His words took me by surprise, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. It wasn't that I hadn't thought about seeing Paul again. Far from it. But hearing Alan suggest it so plainly, so casually, brought a rush of emotions that left me momentarily speechless. "Alan, you really want this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his gaze steady. "Yes, Rose, I think it could be good for you, for us." He reached out, taking my hand. "I want you to feel alive, to experience something new. I want you to see yourself the way I see you, as someone who deserves to feel deeply." His words touched something within me, a vulnerability I hadn't acknowledged before. He wasn't asking this out of indifference or dissatisfaction. He was offering me a gift, a chance to rediscover a part of myself that had faded over time. I felt a lump form in my throat, and I squeezed his hand, searching his face for any hint of doubt or hesitation. But there was none, only a quiet, unwavering resolve. "All right," I said, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions within me. "If that's what you truly want, I'll see him again." The next day, Alan arranged another meeting with Paul, this time at a quiet park near the beach. As I prepared to leave, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, and I barely recognized the woman staring back. There was a brightness in my eyes, a hint of color in my cheeks that I hadn't seen in years. It was as though I were stepping into a new version of myself, one that I hadn't yet fully understood. When I arrived at the park, Paul was already there, sitting on a bench overlooking the water. He rose as I approached, his expression warm, and I felt a sense of ease settle over me. There was no awkwardness, no tension, just the same quiet understanding that had drawn us together the first time. "Rose," he greeted me, his smile genuine. "It's good to see you again." I returned his smile, feeling the familiar warmth of his presence. "You too, Paul. I didn't realize how much I'd missed this. Missed talking to you." He gestured for me to sit beside him, and as I did, I felt a comfortable silence settle between us, the sound of the waves providing a soothing backdrop. We talked for hours, sharing stories, memories, thoughts that had lingered unspoken for years. It was as though we were peeling back layers, discovering parts of ourselves that had been hidden away. At one point, Paul turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "Rose, have you ever felt trapped by the life you built? Not because you don't love it, but because it doesn't allow you to be fully yourself?" His words hit close to home, and I took a deep breath, letting the question sink in. "Yes," I admitted softly. "There have been times when I felt like I'd lost myself in everything, the routines, the responsibilities. It's easy to forget who you are when you spend so much time being someone for everyone else." Paul nodded, his gaze gentle, understanding. "I think that's why I'm here, Rose. I think Alan saw something in you that he wanted to set free, something you've been keeping locked away." I looked at him, surprised by the depth of his insight. "Do you really think that?" He smiled, a quiet confidence in his eyes. "Yes, and I think you're beginning to see it too." As I sat there beside him, I felt a warmth spread through me, a feeling of acceptance and understanding that was unlike anything I'd experienced in years. It wasn't love. Not the kind I'd shared with Alan for so long. But it was something powerful, something that touched a part of me I hadn't realized was still alive. The sun began to set, casting a soft glow over the water, and I felt a gentle sadness settle over me. I didn't want this moment to end, didn't want to lose the connection we'd found. But as I rose to leave, Paul took my hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "Thank you, Rose," he said softly, "for trusting me, for letting me see this part of you." I smiled, my heart full, and as I walked back to my car, I realized that I'd found something I hadn't known I was searching for. A piece of myself I thought I'd lost, rediscovered in the quiet moments shared with a friend. In the days following my meeting with Paul, I found myself caught in a quiet storm of emotions. I felt a newfound lightness, a spark that hadn't been there in years. Paul's words lingered in my mind, his insight about feeling trapped by a life of routines and roles resonating deeply. I found myself looking at the life I shared with Alan through a different lens, grateful for the stability, but now more aware of everything it had quietly demanded of me. But it wasn't just Paul's words. It was how he'd made me feel in those few hours we'd spent together. Seen, understood, respected. I knew it was just friendship, perhaps tinged with something deeper, but harmless, I told myself. Alan had set these meetings in motion. He wanted me to feel alive. Yet, a part of me couldn't shake the quiet sense of betrayal. The feeling that I was holding secrets, even if they were born from his request. Alan noticed the change, of course. He was more attentive than ever, watching me with a new level of curiosity, like he was studying me for signs of what he'd set in motion. I sensed his gaze even in quiet moments, as though he could sense that something was stirring beneath the surface. One evening, after dinner, he finally voiced his curiosity. "Rose," he began, his voice gentle but probing, "have you thought about seeing Paul again?" I looked up from the dishes, surprised. The truth was, I had thought about it often, almost constantly since our last meeting. But I hadn't expected Alan to bring it up so soon, or with such a calm tone. "Yes," I replied, choosing my words carefully. "I've thought about it, but only if you think it's right." Alan nodded, his gaze steady. "I think it's what we agreed to. If it feels right for you, I trust you, Rose." He paused, a hint of something deeper in his expression. "I want you to feel like you're discovering a new side of yourself. That's why I suggested it." I sensed the sincerity in his words, but there was a question lingering beneath the surface, one I didn't quite understand yet. Was he asking this for me, or was there something he was searching for too? Something he hadn't told me? The next morning, I reached out to Paul. I kept my message simple, suggesting another walk by the beach. His response was quick and friendly, and we agreed to meet that afternoon. As I prepared to leave, a strange mix of excitement and guilt gnawed at me. I reminded myself that this was all part of the journey Alan had wanted for us, a journey that felt thrilling and unsettling all at once. When I arrived at the beach, Paul was waiting, hands in his pockets, as he gazed out at the ocean. The sunlight danced on the waves, casting a soft glow over the sand. It felt peaceful, yet charged with something I couldn't name. As I approached, he turned, smiling in that easy, unassuming way that had first put me at ease. "Rose," he greeted me, his eyes warm. "It's good to see you again." We started walking, falling into an easy rhythm. We spoke of simple things at first. The beauty of the beach, memories of our younger years, stories of places we hoped to see one day. But as we walked, the conversation turned more personal. Paul seemed to sense that I had more on my mind, and he waited patiently, allowing me to find the words. Finally, I gathered the courage to voice a question that had been haunting me since this all began. "Paul," I said quietly, "do you think it's possible to rediscover yourself after so many years? Or do you think that who we become, it's all just a product of time and circumstance?" He was quiet for a moment, considering my question. I think we're always rediscovering ourselves in ways we don't realize, he replied. Sometimes it's small, subtle. Other times it's something big, a moment that forces us to see everything in a new way. Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. His words struck a chord, and I found myself reflecting on the choices, routines, and roles that had shaped me over the years. I'd lived a life I was proud of, a life full of love and loyalty, but I couldn't deny that there were parts of myself I'd left behind along the way. Sitting beside Paul, I felt as though I were peering into a mirror, seeing those hidden parts more clearly than ever. You make it sound so simple, I said softly. But isn't there a risk in it, in looking too closely at the things we've hidden away? Paul's gaze softened, and he reached over, placing a reassuring hand on mine. Yes, there's always a risk, Rose. But I think that's what makes life worth living. We spend so much time being afraid of the unknown, but sometimes it's in that uncertainty that we find the pieces of ourselves we've been missing. His words lingered long after we'd said our goodbyes and I'd returned home. I felt as though I'd uncovered a truth I'd known all along but had been too afraid to face. Life was short, unpredictable, and the choices I'd made, every role, every responsibility, had been my way of making sense of it. But now, as I stood on the edge of something new, I realized that there was a part of me that longed for the freedom to explore, to rediscover, to let go of the restraints that had once defined me. When I returned home, Alan was waiting, his gaze questioning as I walked through the door. There was a hint of tension in the air, a quiet anticipation as though he were bracing himself for whatever I might reveal. And I realized in that moment that he was as much a part of this journey as I was, his own questions and insecurities mirroring my own. "How was your day?" he asked, his voice calm but cautious. I looked at him, sensing the quiet vulnerability in his gaze, and I felt a pang of guilt, knowing that this journey we'd embarked on was uncharted territory for both of us. I had expected Alan to be the one with all the answers, the steady presence guiding me through this. But now I saw that he was just as unsure, just as curious, and perhaps just as afraid. "It was good," I replied, choosing my words carefully. "Paul and I talked. He's been helping me see things differently." Alan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm glad, Rose. I wanted this to be something meaningful for you, something that reminds you of the woman you've always been." I looked at him, feeling the weight of his words, and I realized that this wasn't just about me. It was about us. We were both standing on the edge of something new, something neither of us fully understood. And though it terrified me, I felt a quiet determination to see it through, to follow this journey wherever it might lead. As I lay awake that night, listening to the soft rhythm of Alan's breathing beside me, I felt a strange peace settle over me. There was a part of me that feared what we might uncover, feared the truths that lay hidden in the depths of our hearts. But there was also a part of me that was ready to face the unknown, ready to rediscover the woman I had once been, and the marriage we had both quietly yearned to reclaim. The days slipped by, each one pulling me deeper into a quiet, reflective state. I found myself revisiting memories I hadn't thought of in years, moments from my youth, times when life had felt limitless and uncertain. Alan and I had shared so many of those moments, when our whole world had been shaped by spontaneity and passion. And yet, as the years had passed, it seemed we'd drifted into roles we'd both embraced without question. Now, those roles felt both familiar and oddly confining. The words Paul had shared with me echoed in my mind. He had a way of speaking that made me feel as though he were handing me a mirror, allowing me to see myself in ways I hadn't dared to in years. But was I changing, or was I simply rediscovering parts of myself that had been buried beneath years of routine and responsibility? Alan seemed to sense my internal shifts too, and his reactions to them were mixed. Some nights, he'd ask me about my thoughts, his tone curious, even supportive. But other times he seemed more reserved, his eyes clouded with an emotion I couldn't quite read. I wondered if he too was grappling with unspoken questions and doubts, whether he'd begun to worry that, in opening this door, he might find a version of me he wasn't prepared for. One evening, as we sat on the porch together watching the sun sink below the horizon, Alan turned to me, his expression serious. "Rose, are you happy?" he asked quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. The question caught me off guard, and I felt my chest tighten. It was a question we'd never really asked each other in the daily hum of life. Happiness had been a constant we'd assumed, something embedded in the fabric of our marriage. But now, as I looked into Alan's searching eyes, I realized that it was a question I didn't know how to answer. I think I'm learning to understand myself better," I replied carefully. "It's like I'm peeling back layers I'd forgotten were there." He nodded, his gaze distant. "I feel it too," he admitted. "This journey, Rose, it's made me see things differently. About you, about us." He paused, his eyes locking with mine. "Do you ever feel like we've been living half asleep?" The word struck me deeply. "Yes," I whispered, almost relieved to admit it. I didn't realize it, but yes, I think we both have. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of unsaid things. I knew Alan had set this journey in motion out of love, out of a desire to revive something in me he feared was fading. But in doing so, he'd awakened something in both of us that neither of us fully understood. The next day, I decided to go for a walk by myself, hoping the fresh air and quiet would help me sort through the tangled mess of emotions swirling inside me. As I strolled along the familiar paths of our neighborhood, I felt a strange, almost nostalgic sense of freedom. I had spent years walking these paths, years caught in the comfortable rhythms of family and marriage, but now everything felt different, brighter, more vibrant, as though I were seeing it all for the first time. My thoughts drifted to Paul, his presence in my life now a strange mixture of friendship, curiosity, and something else I couldn't quite define. I knew our connection was unique, but it was also tinged with a quiet sadness. I sensed that he, too, was struggling with his own questions, with a past that held unresolved stories. I wondered if he saw me as someone who offered him solace, a connection that allowed him to explore parts of himself he had long set aside. When I returned home that afternoon, Alan was waiting for me in the living room. He looked up as I entered, a hesitant smile crossing his face. "Rose," he began, his tone cautious, "I was wondering if you'd like to go out somewhere tonight, just the two of us, somewhere special." I felt a warmth spread through me, touched by his gesture. "I'd love that, Alan." He seemed relieved, and for the first time in days, I sensed a renewed hope in him, a determination to reclaim something we'd lost. We spent the evening at a small, cozy restaurant we'd loved in our early years. The kind of place with candlelit tables and soft music playing in the background. Sitting across from each other, we felt like two people reconnecting, rediscovering each other in the soft glow of candlelight. As we talked, laughter and memories flowed easily, and I found myself leaning into the familiar comfort of Alan's presence. I had always loved his sense of humor, his quiet steadiness, the way he looked at me as though I were the only person in the room. In that moment, I felt the weight of our shared years, the life we'd built together, and I realized how much I still cherished him. But I also couldn't ignore the quiet voice within me, the one that whispered of the things I was only beginning to uncover, the questions I hadn't yet answered. Alan's love, as steadfast and unwavering as it was, couldn't answer those questions for me. This journey was one I would have to navigate on my own, with or without his approval. When we returned home that night, Alan took my hand, his touch warm and familiar. He looked at me with an intensity I hadn't seen in years, his eyes filled with a quiet longing. "Rose," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion, I don't want to lose you." His words tugged at my heart, and I squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of his vulnerability. "You won't, Alan. I'm here. I'm with you." But even as I spoke the words, I knew they didn't fully capture the truth of my feelings. I was here, yes, but I was also somewhere else, exploring parts of myself I hadn't known existed. And I realized that this journey, as painful and confusing as it was, might lead me to places I hadn't anticipated. Places that could change the very nature of our marriage. That night, as I lay beside Alan in the quiet of our room, I found myself reflecting on the choices that lay ahead. I knew I couldn't deny the shifts happening within me, couldn't ignore the questions I'd buried for so long. And yet I also knew that the love I shared with Alan was real, deeply rooted, and worth fighting for. In the days that followed, I continued to meet Paul, our conversations growing deeper, more personal. He had become a confidant, someone with whom I could explore the thoughts and feelings I was too afraid to voice with Alan. But I was beginning to see the delicate balance I was walking. A balance between my loyalty to Alan and the journey of self-discovery I felt drawn toward. And as much as I cherished Alan's love and the life we'd built, I couldn't ignore the pull of the unknown, the quiet whisper that beckoned me to keep exploring, to keep uncovering the parts of myself I'd long hidden away. For now, all I could do was hold both worlds in my heart. The world of familiarity and love I shared with Alan, and the uncharted, mysterious world that Paul had unknowingly opened to me. And in that delicate balance, I hoped I would find the answers I was searching for. As the weeks passed, my life became an intricate dance between two worlds. With Alan, I held on to the life we'd built, the routines and shared memories that made up our everyday existence. But in my time with Paul, I explored parts of myself I hadn't touched in years, and the freedom I felt was exhilarating. I knew I was treading on delicate ground. Alan's trust had opened doors I'd never dared to approach, yet every step forward left me feeling as though I were straying further from him. In quiet moments, I caught myself wondering if I was being reckless, testing the limits of a trust that had taken years to build. One Saturday afternoon, while Alan was out running errands, Paul and I met at a small park on the edge of town. We'd taken to meeting in quiet places, spots where we could talk without distractions. The sun was high, casting a soft, warm light over the trees, and we walked in easy silence along the winding path. After a while, we sat on a bench overlooking a small pond, watching the ducks glide across the water. Paul turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "You seem different lately," he said gently, studying my face. "More at ease, but maybe a little conflicted too?" I hesitated, feeling the weight of his gaze. Paul had become attuned to my moods in ways even I hadn't expected, but there was a vulnerability in his question that caught me off guard. I realized he wasn't just asking out of curiosity, he was searching for answers himself. "Yes," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I felt so many things I didn't expect, things I'm still trying to understand." Paul nodded, his expression understanding. "It's hard, isn't it? This journey of self-discovery, especially when it feels like it's pulling you away from everything familiar." I nodded, grateful for his insight. "I've always been the steady one," I said, my voice filled with an unexpected sadness. "For years I thought that was enough, but now I'm realizing that there's so much more, things I hadn't let myself feel or even imagine." As I spoke, I felt a surge of guilt, a pang that reminded me of the quiet life I shared with Alan. I knew he'd encouraged this journey, even embraced it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was straying into unknown territory, somewhere he might not be able to follow. "Do you think," I began, my voice hesitant, "that we ever really know ourselves? Or are we just shaped by the lives we lead, the roles we play?" Paul was quiet for a moment, considering my question. "I think we're always a work in progress," he said thoughtfully, "and sometimes life forces us to confront parts of ourselves we've ignored. It's not easy, but maybe that's where growth happens." His words resonated deeply. I had always believed in the certainty of things, the solidity of my marriage, the comfort of routine. But now I was beginning to see that life wasn't as fixed as I had once thought. There were layers within me, layers I was only beginning to explore. As we sat there, an unexpected urge washed over me, a desire to ask Paul something I'd been afraid to acknowledge. It wasn't about us or even about our conversations. It was about my marriage, my relationship with Alan, and the uncharted path we were both on. "Paul," I began, feeling a wave of vulnerability, "do you think it's possible to have two worlds, two sides of yourself that need different things?" He looked at me, his eyes soft but serious. "I think it's possible, yes, but it's also complicated. Balancing those worlds can be exhausting, and sometimes it forces us to make choices we didn't expect." His answer lingered in my mind long after we said goodbye that day. I returned home feeling torn, as though I were caught between two identities: the Rose who loved Alan, who cherished the life we'd built together, and the Rose who longed for freedom, for something more. That evening, as Alan and I sat together in the living room, I felt the weight of everything I hadn't told him. There was a tension between us that had been growing quietly, like an unspoken question neither of us dared to voice. I knew he sensed my inner conflict, and I could see the worry etched into his features. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, I turned to him. "Alan," I said softly, "can we talk?" He looked at me, his expression both guarded and hopeful. "Of course, Rose, what's on your mind?" I took a deep breath, searching for the right words. I've been thinking a lot lately about us, about who I am. And I feel like I'm caught between two worlds. The life we have together, the one I cherish, and this other part of me that's been awakened, this desire to explore parts of myself I've ignored. Alan was silent, his gaze focused on his hands as he listened. I could feel the tension radiating from him, but he didn't interrupt. "I know you encouraged this journey," I continued, my voice barely above a whisper. "But now I feel as though I'm walking a line I don't fully understand. I don't want to lose what we have, Alan, but I also don't want to ignore this part of myself." He looked up then, his eyes filled with a quiet sorrow. "Rose," he murmured, his voice thick with them, "I never wanted you to feel torn. I wanted you to feel alive, to see yourself the way I see you." His words touched me deeply, and I reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I know, Alan, and I appreciate it more than you know. But now I'm realizing that this journey isn't as simple as I thought. I can't pretend that I'm the same person I was before." We sat in silence, both of us lost in thought. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the way he was studying me as though he were searching for answers he wasn't ready to confront. Finally he spoke, his voice filled with a quiet resignation. "I don't want to hold you back, Rose," he said, his tone raw. "I don't want you to feel like you have to choose between who you are and who we are. But I also don't know how to be a part of this new world you're exploring." His admission cut deep, and I felt a wave of sadness wash over me. I realized then that this journey had changed us both in ways we couldn't undo. We were two people standing on the edge of something unknown, unsure of where it would lead. "I don't have all the answers, Alan," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "But I know that I love you, and whatever happens, I want us to face it together." He nodded, his expression softened by a quiet acceptance. "Then we will," he murmured, his hand reaching up to brush a stray hair from my face. "We'll figure this out, one step at a time." In that moment, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that perhaps, even in the midst of uncertainty, we could find a way forward. We were both on a journey, both searching for something we couldn't fully name. And though the path was unclear, I knew that, somehow, we would walk it together. The days that followed were thick with quiet contemplation. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was drifting somewhere between two lives, one with Alan, shaped by years of trust and routine, and another more nebulous one that was still forming, filled with questions and unmet desires. Each life felt as real as the other, and I couldn't tell which was pulling me harder. One afternoon, while Alan was out at a friend's house, I sat by the window, gazing out at the garden Alan and I had planted together years ago. A mix of colors stretched across the flower beds, vibrant marigolds, delicate roses, and the ivy that Alan so carefully trimmed. I realized how much the garden had come to represent us, each flower a memory, a promise, a small testament to the life we'd nurtured together. But now, looking at it, I felt something close to sadness, an ache I couldn't name. The beauty of it seemed tinged with fragility, as though I could see the cracks forming in the soil, creeping slowly toward the roots. The life Alan and I had built was still beautiful, still whole, but I couldn't ignore the changes taking place within me. The ones that threatened to uproot everything I'd thought was permanent. My phone buzzed, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was a message from Paul. "How are you?" The simplicity of his questions struck me. Over the weeks, Paul had become more than a confidant. He was a mirror. Someone who allowed me to see parts of myself I hadn't known were there. But the more time I spent with him, the more I felt the boundaries of my own comfort stretch. He didn't pressure me, yet there was an intensity in our conversations that always left me feeling as though I were teetering on the edge of something unknown. After a pause, I typed a reply, conflicted. "Can we meet?" Paul's response was immediate. "Of course, the usual spot." Half an hour later, I was walking down the familiar path toward the small park where we often met. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine, and a soft wind rustled through the trees. When I saw Paul standing by the bench, his expression thoughtful, I felt a strange mix of relief and nervousness wash over me. He turned as I approached, his smile warm. "Rose," he greeted me softly, his eyes searching mine. "You seem a little lost today." I took a deep breath, sitting down on the bench beside him. "I am," I admitted. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, Paul, about, well, everything. My marriage, who I am, who I've become." Paul nodded, listening intently. There was a calmness about him that always seemed to put me at ease, a quiet acceptance that allowed me to speak freely. "Being with you," I continued, struggling to find the right words, "it's opened up parts of myself I thought I'd buried. And I think that's what scares me most, because I don't know where it's all leading." Paul reached over, placing a reassuring hand on mine. "Change is never easy, Rose," he said softly. "Especially when it shakes the foundation of everything you thought you knew. But maybe that's the point. Maybe you're meant to explore these parts of yourself, even if it's painful." His words resonated, but they also stirred a deep sense of guilt. Alan had encouraged this journey, yes, but how much did he really know about where it would lead? I hadn't been dishonest, but I also hadn't shared everything. There were feelings and thoughts I couldn't voice with him, at least not yet, and the weight of that unspoken truth grew heavier with each passing day. "Do you ever think," I asked Paul, my voice tinged with hesitation, "that maybe some things are best left unexplored? That maybe we have these boundaries for a reason?" Paul was quiet, his gaze fixed on a spot in the distance. "I used to believe that," he admitted, "but life has a way of testing those beliefs. I think we create boundaries to keep ourselves safe, to avoid confronting the uncomfortable parts of ourselves. But sometimes those are the parts that need the most attention." I looked down, considering his words. They made sense, but they didn't make the journey any easier. I was beginning to see that self-discovery wasn't always a gentle, enlightening process. Sometimes it was raw, painful, like pulling at threads that could unravel everything. Paul seemed to sense my inner turmoil. He squeezed my hand, his touch grounding. "You don't have to figure it all out today, Rose. Maybe just allow yourself to feel whatever you're feeling, without judgment. Trust yourself to find your way." I smiled, grateful for his presence. Thank you, Paul. I don't know if I'd be able to make sense of any of this without you. He looked at me, his eyes filled with an intensity that made my heart race. You're stronger than you think, Rose. Don't ever forget that. As we sat there, a comfortable silence settled between us. But I couldn't ignore the emotions stirring within me, the ones that were quickly becoming impossible to deny. Being with Paul brought out a side of me I hadn't known existed, a part that craved freedom, excitement, a release from the confines of the life I'd built. But at what cost? Later that evening, I returned home, my mind still buzzing with thoughts. Alan was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, and he looked up as I entered, a small smile on his face. "Busy day?" he asked, his tone light. I nodded, feeling the weight of everything I hadn't shared with him. Yes, a lot on my mind. Alan paused, studying me for a moment. "You've seemed distant lately, Rose. I know you're going through a lot, but if there's anything you need to talk about, I'm here." The sincerity in his voice tugged at my heart, filling me with a deep sense of guilt. He'd given me so much trust, and yet here I was, unable to fully share the journey I was on, the thoughts and feelings that had come to define my days. "Thank you, Alan," I whispered, forcing a smile. "I know." He reached out, pulling me into an embrace, and I felt the familiar warmth of his arms around me. It was comforting, grounding. And yet, a part of me felt as though I were slipping away from him, as though I were living a life he could never fully understand. That night, as I lay beside him in bed, I stared up at the ceiling, my mind racing. I realized that this journey wasn't just about self-discovery. It was about the choices I would have to make, the boundaries I would either respect or cross. And I knew, deep down, that I couldn't avoid those choices forever. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with questions I couldn't yet answer. But one thing was clear. I was no longer the woman I had been. I was changing, evolving, and I wasn't sure where that would lead me, or what it would mean for my marriage. As I drifted into an uneasy sleep, one thought lingered. I couldn't keep living in two worlds. Sooner or later, I would have to choose. The days following that conversation with Alan weighed on me. I knew I had reached a pivotal point, a point where I couldn't ignore the pull between two worlds, between two versions of myself. Every time I looked at Alan, I felt the enormity of what I was holding back, the secrets I was keeping under the guise of self-discovery. And with Paul, there was an undeniable growing tension. I could sense that he, too, felt the weight of our connection, even if neither of us said it out loud. One evening, Alan came home later than usual, his face drawn and tired. He placed his keys on the counter with a soft clink and gave me a weary smile. There was something different about him, a distance in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I wondered if he was beginning to sense the shift between us, or if he'd grown weary of our unspoken tension. "Long day?" I asked, trying to gauge his mood. He nodded, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I stayed late to finish up a few things at work." Alan wasn't usually one to bring his workday home, but tonight he seemed different, quieter, more introspective. I felt a pang of guilt, wondering if my distance was beginning to affect him, to drain the joy from our once effortless partnership. As we ate dinner in silence, I felt an impulse to reach out, to bridge the gap that had slowly widened between us. I wanted to reassure him, to let him know that I still cherished our life together, even as I wrestled with the parts of myself that felt stifled, restless. But I didn't know where to start, or even if I should. How could I explain something I barely understood myself? Alan broke the silence first. "Rose," he began, his voice tentative, "do you feel different lately? Do you feel like you're changing?" His question took me by surprise, and for a moment I hesitated, not knowing how to answer. Part of me wanted to deny it, to pretend that everything was the same as it had always been. But I knew that wouldn't be fair. To him or to myself. "Yes," I admitted softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like like I'm rediscovering parts of myself I'd forgotten, and sometimes it scares me. Alan nodded, his gaze steady as he listened. I think I understand, he said quietly. I encouraged you to explore because I wanted you to feel fulfilled, to feel like you weren't missing out on life. But lately, it feels like you're drifting further away from me, rather than closer. His words hit me like a jolt. I had wanted to believe that this journey of self-discovery would somehow bring us closer, that it would add depth to our relationship. But instead, I'd begun to realize that my search for freedom was creating a chasm between us, one that seemed to grow wider each day. I don't want to lose you, Rose, Alan said, his voice breaking slightly. But I feel like I'm watching you slip away, and I don't know how to stop it. A knot formed in my throat, and I reached across the table, a cat taking his hand in mine. I don't want to lose you either, Alan. This has been harder than I ever imagined. It's as if I'm caught between two lives, and I can't seem to find where I truly belong. We sat in silence, holding each other's gaze. In that moment, I felt the depth of his love for me, the unwavering support he had always given. But I also saw the fear in his eyes, the fear that I was changing in ways he couldn't understand, couldn't follow. The next day, I met Paul for coffee at a small cafe on the edge of town. We hadn't seen each other since our conversation at the park, and I could sense that he, too, felt the weight of what had been left unsaid. He greeted me with a warm smile, but his eyes held a quiet tension. As we sat down with our drinks, I felt the familiar pull between us, the unspoken connection that had deepened over the weeks. But now it felt heavier, tinged with an intensity that was beginning to overwhelm me. I've been thinking about our conversations, I began, my voice low. About everything we've shared. Paul nodded, his gaze steady. So have I, he admitted. It feels like we've reached a turning point, doesn't it? Yes, I replied, my heart pounding. And I don't know where to go from here. He was silent for a moment, as though choosing his words carefully. Rose, he said finally, I don't want to complicate things for you. I care about you more than I thought I would. But I know you have a life with Alan, a life that means a lot to you. The sincerity in his voice touched me deeply, and I felt a surge of gratitude. Paul wasn't asking for anything. He was simply acknowledging the complexity of our connection, the delicate balance we were trying to maintain. But, he continued, his voice softer, I think you have to decide what you really want, whether it's with Alan, with me, or with yourself. You can't live in two worlds forever. His words lingered in my mind long after we said goodbye. I returned home that evening, feeling the weight of his advice pressing down on me. I knew he was right. I couldn't continue drifting between two lives, clinging to the security of my marriage while exploring a new side of myself with Paul. Sooner or later, I would have to make a choice. That night, as Alan and I lay in bed, I felt a deep sadness settle over me. I turned to him, studying the familiar lines of his face, the gentle rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. This was the man I had built a life with, the man who had been by my side through every joy and sorrow. But now, I felt as though I were standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, a place where he might not be able to follow. Alan, I whispered, my voice trembling. What if I need something more, something I can't fully explain? He was quiet for a long time, his gaze distant as he processed my words. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but I could hear the pain beneath it. I've always known that, Rose. I think, deep down, I've always known you needed more than I could give. Tears filled my eyes, and I reached for his hand, clinging to it as though it were the only thing keeping me grounded. I love you, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. I don't want to lose you. He pulled me close, wrapping his arms around me in a way that felt both comforting and heartbreaking. Then we'll find a way through this, together, he murmured. But we can't keep ignoring the truth. We can't keep pretending that things are the same. In that moment, I realized that this journey had irrevocably changed us both. There was no going back to the life we'd once known. But perhaps, in facing these truths together, we could find a way forward, a path that honored who we were and who we were becoming. I didn't know what the future held, or if we could bridge the distance that had grown between us. But I knew that, whatever happened, we would face it together. The following morning, I awoke to an unusual calm. Alan's side of the bed was empty, and I could hear the faint clink of dishes in the kitchen. It was still early, the kind of quiet hour we rarely shared. I lingered in bed for a moment, gathering my thoughts, letting the reality of the night before sink in. Alan and I had finally acknowledged the distance between us, the shifting contours of our marriage. The vulnerability of that moment had left me feeling exposed, but also strangely liberated. For so long, I'd carried my questions and doubts alone, fearing what they might do to our relationship. But now, it was all out in the open. There was no pretending, no hiding. We were finally facing the truth. I slipped out of bed, pulling on a sweater as I made my way to the kitchen. Alan was standing by the counter, a cup of coffee in hand. He looked up as I entered, offering me a faint smile. There was a new softness in his expression, an openness that hadn't been there before. "Morning," he greeted me, his voice warm but tentative. "Good morning," I replied, taking the cup of coffee he offered. We sat at the kitchen table in silence, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. I knew this was the moment to start a conversation, one that could determine the future of our marriage. "Alan," I began, my voice steady but hesitant. "I know we both said things last night, things that are hard to face. But I want you to know that I'm committed to us. I don't want to lose what we've built." He nodded, looking down at his cup. "I feel the same way, Rose. I don't want to lose you either. But I think we both know that things have to change." His words were gentle, but they cut through me all the same. Change. It was the very thing I had been resisting, even as I'd sought it out with Paul. I had been trying to live two lives, one in the safety of my marriage and another in the freedom of self-discovery. But I knew now that I couldn't have both. The life I wanted, the woman I was becoming, demanded honesty. "Maybe we need to redefine what our marriage means," I said carefully. "Maybe we need to find a way to let each other grow without feeling like we're holding each other back." Alan looked up, his gaze steady as he considered my words. "Are you saying you want us to have more freedom, to explore outside of what we have?" I hesitated, feeling a flush rise in my cheeks. This was territory we'd never dared enter, ideas I'd barely allowed myself to entertain. But as I met Alan's gaze, I saw something that surprised me. Understanding. He wasn't shocked or hurt. He was listening, genuinely open to the conversation. "Yes," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Maybe that's something we should consider. I don't know what that would look like or if it would even work for us, but I think we have to be honest about what we both need." Alan nodded slowly, his face thoughtful. "I can see that, Rose. I can see how that might give us both room to grow, to explore parts of ourselves we haven't before." He paused, looking down at his hands. "But there's one thing I need to know. For myself. Is this about Paul?" His question hung in the air between us, and I felt my heart skip. I had always been open with Alan about my friendship with Paul, but I hadn't shared the full extent of my feelings or the magnetic pull I felt toward him. But if this conversation was going to mean anything, I had to be honest. "Yes," I replied, my voice soft. "Paul has been a part of this journey for me. He's helped me see parts of myself that I had forgotten about. But it's not just about him. This is about me, about discovering who I am beyond the roles I've played for so long." Alan took a deep breath, and I could see the tension in his shoulders ease just slightly. "Thank you for being honest," he said quietly. "It's not easy to hear, but I'd rather know the truth than be left in the dark. I want you to feel fulfilled, Rose. I want you to feel like you're living a life that's true to who you are." His words filled me with both relief and sadness. Here was a man who loved me deeply, who wanted nothing more than to see me happy. And yet, that very love was pushing us toward a place where we might find happiness outside of each other. It was a realization as painful as it was liberating. "So where do we go from here?" I asked, the question as much for myself as for him. Alan was silent for a moment, then he looked up, his eyes meeting mine with a quiet determination. "We take it one step at a time. We figure out what this means for us, what boundaries we need, and what we're both comfortable with. And if at any point this doesn't feel right, we talk. We keep the lines open." The simplicity of his plan felt grounding. It reminded me that we didn't have to have all the answers right now, that this was a journey we could navigate together, with patience and honesty. Over the days that followed, we began to set small, tentative boundaries. We agreed that honesty was the most important foundation. If either of us felt uncomfortable, we would speak up. Alan encouraged me to continue my friendship with Paul, but he asked that I share my feelings with him openly, so he wouldn't feel like a bystander in my life. In turn, I encouraged Alan to pursue his own interests, to rediscover the passions he'd put aside over the years. It was a delicate balance, a dance between freedom and connection. Some days I felt like we were making progress, that we were growing together in ways we hadn't before. But other days, I struggled with doubts, fearing that this new openness could drive us further apart rather than bring us closer. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Alan turned to me, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Do you ever wonder, Rose," he began slowly, "if this is what we were meant to find all along? This sense of freedom, of choice?" I considered his question, feeling the weight of it settle over me. "Maybe," I replied, my voice soft. "Maybe we were meant to reach this point, to find a way to love each other without holding each other back." He nodded, a quiet smile crossing his face. "It's a strange feeling, isn't it? To love someone enough to let them go, even if it's just a little bit." "Yes," I agreed, my heart swelling with a mixture of love and sadness. "But maybe that's the truest kind of love there is." As we sat together, hand in hand, I realized that our marriage was transforming into something I had never imagined. It was no longer bound by convention or expectation. Instead, it was evolving into a partnership rooted in choice, a choice to be together, even as we allowed ourselves to explore who we were as individuals. The future felt uncertain, the path ahead still unclear, but for the first time, I felt a sense of peace. Alan and I were building something new, something that honored both our shared past and our separate journeys. And in that moment, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. Free, but deeply connected. As the weeks passed, Alan and I settled into an unfamiliar but intriguing rhythm. Our relationship felt lighter, as though a hidden weight had been lifted. We had given each other permission to explore, to rediscover, and to be honest about our needs. Yet, beneath the newfound freedom, I sensed we were both struggling to understand what this would truly mean for our marriage. One Saturday afternoon, we found ourselves in our cozy living room, wrapped in blankets as the rain pattered softly against the windows. I had spent the morning journaling, capturing fragments of thoughts and emotions that had been swirling through me since our conversation. Alan, too, seemed introspective, his eyes focused on the drizzle outside, yet distant. "I feel like we're living in a dream sometimes," he mused, his voice quiet, "as though we're both here and yet exploring worlds beyond each other." I nodded, understanding his sentiment all too well. It was a strange sensation, to be so deeply connected to someone while simultaneously allowing them the space to wander, to discover parts of themselves beyond the marriage. And while there was beauty in that, there was also a sense of uncertainty that I couldn't shake. "Do you ever worry," I began hesitantly, that we might drift too far from each other. Alan looked over at me, his expression thoughtful. Sometimes, yes. But I also think that this is something we both need to do, for ourselves as much as for each other. I think, as long as we keep talking, as long as we're honest, we can find a way to stay close. His words reassured me, though I couldn't deny the occasional pang of doubt. The journey we had embarked on felt both liberating and precarious, a balancing act between intimacy and independence. And even though we'd set boundaries, I sometimes found myself questioning where those boundaries truly lay. Alan had recently begun attending a local art class, something he'd always wanted to do, but had put off for years. Seeing him embrace this new passion filled me with happiness, though a part of me couldn't help but wonder if he, too, would find himself drawn to the possibilities beyond our marriage. One evening, I noticed him chatting with a woman in his class, a friendly conversation that seemed harmless but made me feel an unexpected twist of jealousy. She was animated, laughing at something he'd said, her attention fully on him. For a moment, I felt a familiar possessiveness, the desire to claim him, to ensure that his heart remained firmly within our marriage. But I reminded myself that this was part of the openness we had agreed upon, a freedom that cut both ways. I realized then how challenging true trust could be. It wasn't just about accepting Alan's exploration, it was about accepting my own insecurities and learning to let them go. And as difficult as it was, I knew that I needed to trust Alan fully, just as he trusted me. One evening, Alan surprised me with tickets to a small art exhibit in the city. I thought it might be nice for us to have a night out, he said with a smile. To reconnect, just the two of us. I was touched by his gesture, sensing that he, too, felt the need to reinforce the foundation of our marriage amid the changes. The evening was perfect. The quiet hum of the gallery, the soft glow of the lights on the artwork, the subtle excitement in the air. As we wandered through the exhibit, discussing the pieces and sharing our thoughts, I felt a sense of intimacy that had been missing in our lives for a long time. Afterward, we found a quiet corner in a nearby cafe, sipping our drinks as we talked about everything from the exhibit to our childhood memories. There was a warmth between us, a closeness that reminded me why I had fallen in love with Alan all those years ago. It was a comforting reminder that, no matter how much we explored outside of each other, we still had this shared bond, a bond that couldn't be replicated or replaced. "Thank you for tonight," I said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "I needed this." He squeezed my hand, his smile soft. "So did I. I know things are different now, but that doesn't mean we can't have nights like this." His words reassured me, and I felt a renewed sense of commitment to making our marriage work, even as we navigated its evolving boundaries. I realized then that love wasn't a fixed state. It was something that ebbed and flowed, something that could change and adapt without losing its essence. But the next morning brought another challenge. Paul called, asking if we could meet for coffee. My heart raced at the sound of his voice, the familiar warmth that had become so much a part of my life. I knew I couldn't turn him down, not after the honesty Alan and I had cultivated. So, after a quiet conversation with Alan, I went to meet Paul. As I sat across from him, I felt the magnetic pull between us, the connection that had brought me to this place of self-discovery. Paul looked at me, his gaze thoughtful. "How's everything going with Alan?" he asked, his tone gentle. "We're doing okay," I replied, nodding. "We've come to an understanding. We're trying to figure out what our marriage looks like now, and so far, it's been both beautiful and challenging." Paul smiled, a mixture of admiration and understanding in his expression. "You're incredibly brave, Rose. Not everyone would have the courage to redefine love like this." His words touched me deeply, and for a moment I felt a swell of emotion, a mixture of gratitude and longing. Being with Paul had unlocked a part of me that I hadn't known existed, a part that craved adventure and connection beyond the familiar. But I also knew that my heart, at its core, still belonged to Alan. As we sat in that cafe, I realized that my journey with Paul had been a catalyst, a force that had propelled me toward self-discovery. But it was Alan who remained my anchor, the person who held my heart through every storm, every change. When I returned home, I found Alan waiting for me, his expression open and calm. "How was it?" he asked, his voice steady. "It was good," I replied, taking his hand. "Paul has helped me understand a part of myself I'd lost, but you're the one I want to build a life with." Alan's face softened, and he pulled me into an embrace. "I know, Rose, and I want to be with you, wherever this journey takes us." In that moment, I felt a sense of clarity, a quiet understanding that our marriage was evolving into something rare, a love built on choice, on trust, and on the courage to let each other grow. I knew there would be more challenges ahead, more moments of uncertainty. But I also knew that, together, we could face them. Our marriage wasn't bound by tradition or convention. It was a living, breathing thing, one that could adapt, change, and deepen with time. And as Alan held me in his arms, I realized that this was what I had been searching for all along, a love that could embrace both freedom and connection. We stood there in the quiet of our home, wrapped in each other's arms, ready to face whatever came next. And in that moment, I knew that we would be okay. A few months had passed since Alan and I began reimagining our marriage. Life felt steadier, as though we had found a balance in the midst of change. We'd grown used to our new boundaries, to the openness and honesty that had become the foundation of our relationship. Yet beneath the routine of our daily lives, I sensed that our journey was far from over. We were still learning, still discovering what this new phase of our marriage meant. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Alan turned to me, his face illuminated by the fading light. "Rose," he said quietly, "do you ever think about how far we've come?" I looked at him, feeling the warmth of his gaze, the quiet love that had grown stronger through everything we'd faced. "I do," I replied, my voice filled with emotion. "There were times I didn't know if we'd make it through, but somehow, here we are." He nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It hasn't been easy, has it?" I shook my head, remembering the sleepless nights, the moments of doubt, and the difficult conversations. "No, it hasn't. But it's been worth it. I feel like we're finally seeing each other for who we really are, not just the roles we've played all these years." Alan reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "I think you're right. I've learned more about myself in these past few months than I have in years. And I know it's because of you. Because of us." As we sat there, hand in hand, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the man beside me. He had been my partner for so many years, but now he was also my friend, my confidant, and, in many ways, my mirror. Through him, I had learned to see myself in new ways, to embrace the parts of me I had once kept hidden, and I knew he felt the same. But even with this newfound closeness, there were moments of uncertainty. There were times when I worried that our openness would eventually drive us apart, that the freedom we'd given each other could one day lead us in different directions. I had shared these fears with Alan, and he had listened patiently, reassuring me with his calm presence and steady love. "We can't predict the future, Rose," he had told me one night, his voice gentle but firm. "All we can do is stay present, stay honest, and trust that our love will guide us through whatever comes next." His words had comforted me then, and they continued to reassure me now. But as much as I trusted him, I knew that the true test of our love would come with time. Could we sustain this balance, this delicate dance between independence and connection? Only time would tell. One weekend, Alan suggested we take a short trip to the coast, a place that held many memories for us from when we were young. It was there that he had proposed, there that we had spent countless summer days with our children, and there that we had once dreamed of growing old together. The idea of returning to that place filled me with nostalgia, a reminder of the love that had carried us through so many seasons of life. The drive to the coast was filled with laughter and stories, memories of our early days and the dreams we had shared. We stopped at a small cafe along the way, reliving old moments and creating new ones. There was a sweetness to our time together, a sense of coming full circle. When we arrived at the beach, the air was crisp, the scent of salt and seaweed filling our lungs. We walked along the shore, our feet sinking into the cool sand as the waves lapped at our toes. It felt like a return to simpler times, a reminder of the innocence and hope that had defined our early years together. As we strolled hand in hand, Alan stopped suddenly, turning to face me. "Rose," he said softly, his eyes filled with emotion, "I know we've been through a lot this year, but standing here with you now, I feel like we're stronger than ever." I looked into his eyes, feeling the truth of his words resonate deep within me. "I feel it too, Alan. I never imagined we would find ourselves here, but I wouldn't change a thing. Every step of this journey has brought us closer." He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Do you remember that day we first came here? How we sat on this very beach, talking about all the things we wanted for our future?" I nodded, a smile tugging at my lips as the memories flooded back. We were so young, so full of dreams, and now here we are, living them in ways we never could have imagined. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the ocean, Alan pulled me into his arms. We stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, watching the colors shift and fade across the water. It was a moment of pure peace, a reminder that, despite everything, our love remained strong. That night, as we lay in the small seaside inn, Alan took my hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on my skin. "Rose," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, "I want you to know that, no matter where life takes us, you are my home. You're the one I want to grow old with." His words brought tears to my eyes, a rush of gratitude filling my heart. "And you're mine, Alan. You always have been, and you always will be." In that quiet moment, I realized that our love had transformed into something deeper, something rooted in choice and understanding. We were no longer bound by the expectations of our past or the limitations we had once placed on ourselves. Instead, we were free to love each other as we were, in all our complexities and imperfections. The next morning, as we packed our bags and prepared to leave, I felt a sense of closure, as though we had reached a new chapter in our lives. The road ahead was still unknown, but I was no longer afraid. I knew that, whatever challenges lay ahead, Alan and I would face them together, with honesty, patience, and a love that had grown stronger through every trial. As we drove home, I glanced over at Alan, feeling a warmth spread through me. He was humming along to an old song on the radio, his hand resting comfortably on mine. It was a simple moment, but it was one that encapsulated everything we had worked for. The comfort of familiarity, the thrill of new possibilities, and the steady presence of a love that had weathered every storm. When we arrived home, the house felt quiet, but it was a comforting silence, one filled with the promise of all the memories yet to be made. We unpacked our bags, settling back into our routine, but I knew that our lives would never be the same. We had opened a door to a new way of loving, one that honored both our individuality and our shared journey. In the weeks that followed, we continued to embrace the openness that had become a part of our lives. There were moments of doubt, moments of fear, but we faced them together, leaning on each other for strength. And through it all, our love deepened.